So, when I was a child, I used to go to school and I'd learn about Texas history and American history and world history. Then on Sunday, I'd go to church and I'd go to Sunday school and learn about biblical history. Now, when I was at school, I never really heard about any of the people, places, or events that I heard about in Sunday school. And when I went to Sunday school, I never really heard about any of the people, places, or events that I was learning about at school. And so, as a child, it was easy for me to wonder, are those Bible stories true? I never hear about them in school. And so, as an adult, one of the things that I have attempted to do is to integrate what I have learned from world history along with the biblical history that I've learned about and put those two together into an integrated history of the world, if you will. Okay? So, in the same way that when I was a child, and I questioned whether or not these Bible stories were true, there are scholars who believe that a lot of the Old Testament is completely fabricated. They believe that it's been invented. They believe that ancient writers existing in the Persian or the Hellenistic period made up these stories a good 1,000 to 1,500 years after the events that they're supposedly describing. And they believe that it has no basis in history whatsoever. Now, these scholars are known as biblical minimalists. And so Philip Davies is a minimalist, and he summarizes the position in his book. He notes, "I'm going to argue that there is no such, quote, ancient Israel, which wrote the Bible. The literature itself was at least largely compiled into its present form and most entirely written at a time later, during the rule of the Persians and then the Hellenistic monarchies. Most of the, quote, biblical period consists not only of unhistorical persons and events, but even of tracts of time that do not belong in history at all. There is simply no point in seeking historical dates for Abraham, Isaac, or Jacob. There was no pre-existent history to be written about, no tradition. And so various accounts had to first be invented, and only later were they reconciled and combined into a fairly coherent sequence." Now, this is not a trivial point. That there was no national tradition to begin with is extremely important to understand. We'll revisit this topic of minimalism here in a moment, but first let's take a look at the biblical outline of the narrative that we're going to be focusing on today. So, Abraham was a man that God chose to father a nation, and God made a covenant with him and his descendants. One of his descendants, Jacob, had 12 sons, of which Joseph was his favorite. Joseph's brothers, in a fit of jealousy, sold him as a slave to a caravan on their way to Egypt. And through a series of events, Joseph would eventually rise to be the leader in Egypt, second only to Pharaoh. And then due to a famine, eventually the rest of Joseph's family, his father Jacob, brothers and all, would immigrate and settle in Egypt. Now, over hundreds of years, these descendants would grow in number. Eventually, a new Pharaoh would come along, quote, one who did not know Joseph, and would oppress and enslave this group, which over time came to be known as the Israelites. God would then raise a man named Moses to deliver them from their enslavement in Egypt and to help them to traverse to their historical promised land in Canaan. This has become known as the Exodus. Now, biblical tradition maintains that Moses wrote most of the details of this Genesis narrative and that later editors redacted his writings to put together the first 5 books of the Bible known as the Pentateuch. So what sort of archaeological or historical evidence do we have for this narrative? Well, archaeology is the study of historic persons and events by the artifacts and the remains that are left behind. And archaeology is very helpful in helping to inform us in regard to human history and illuminate some of the ancient texts that we have, whether they be biblical or otherwise. And biblical archaeology is focused on those remains and artifacts that are specific to the biblical narrative. Now, it would be highly unlikely that we will ever recover any archaeological data on Abraham and the other patriarchs detailed in Genesis because they were just wandering families living a pastoral, nomadic lifestyle. They weren't governments. They didn't build cities. They didn't erect monuments. They didn't live in stone buildings or stone houses. They didn't really do anything that would cause another government to write about them so that we would know about their history, other than Israel's history. However, the story of Joseph entering Egypt and rising to power is one of the first areas where we should reasonably expect to find some archaeological or non-biblical references to biblical persons and events. And furthermore, the enslavement of the Israelites as a people in Egypt is another area that I think that we could reasonably hope and expect to find some sort of archaeological or historical confirmation. So what do we find in the historical and the archaeological record? William Dever is an internationally respected archaeologist. However, he is often credited with undermining the very veracity of biblical archaeology. Now, he considers himself to be a moderate, and I do think that that's an accurate description of him because he's certainly not a biblical minimalist. Nevertheless, in one of his books, he notes, "No one has ever found any archaeological evidence for Exodus from Egypt. No Egyptian text ever found contains a single reference to Hebrews or Israelites in Egypt, much less to an Exodus." Now, conversely, Kenneth Kitchen is an equally distinguished Egyptologist, and Kitchen takes a much more favorable view of the biblical narrative. He believes that the narrative is true unless demonstrated otherwise. This is what he said in one of his books. "No Egyptian records mention specifically Israelites working in the East Delta or anywhere else, or a Moses who spoke for such a group, or an Exodus by a group of this name," referring to Israel. The point being is that scholars universally agree that there at present is no direct evidence for the existence of Israel in Egypt. However, it doesn't mean that the narrative isn't true. J. Warner Wallace has made the point that almost all of his cold cases are solved by appealing to a compelling body of indirect evidence. He makes the point that if they had direct evidence, the case would never go cold. Okay? He says that you can demonstrate something beyond a reasonable doubt by appealing to a collective body of indirect evidence, and that's what we're going to attempt to do this morning. So there's a saying in archaeology that the absence of evidence isn't necessarily evidence of absence. It is a recognition that archaeology only rediscovers the smallest fraction of history, and so one should be very careful about making sweeping judgments based upon a minimal amount of recovered or excavated data. And when we're dealing with archaeology, it's important to always humbly keep that in mind. Let's take a look at our biblical timeline as best we know it. So according to 1 Kings chapter 6, verse 1, Solomon began to build his temple in the 4th year of his reign, which we know to be 966 BC. He rose to power in 970 BC. The 4th year of his reign was 966 BC. These dates are the earliest biblical dates for which we have the highest degree of confidence that they're true and accurate, that they're specifically accurate. We've been able to triangulate the history, Israel's history with Assyrian history and Egyptian history to nail down that this is the date of this event. So these dates are very important for dating other biblical events, okay? Now that passage in 1 Kings also notes that it had been 480 years since the Israelites had left Egypt. So if that's true, that would put the Exodus at about 1446 BC, roughly. Exodus chapter 12 says that the Israelites had been in Israel for about 430 years. So if that's true, then that would mean that Joseph and Jacob and their families settled in Egypt at approximately 1876 BC. So these two dates are very important for our presentation today. It's very important to know that it appears that the Israelites, that Joseph and Jacob and their families settled in Egypt in 1876 BC, and then they left Egypt via the Exodus, their descendants left in 1446 BC. Now, I do think it's important for you to know that there are scholars who believe that both of those dates are about 150 to 200 years later. They put more emphasis on their interpretation of the archaeological record, and they de-emphasize a straight reading of the biblical text. Now, I think it's just good for you to know that there are these two different opinions, but my point is that the evidence we're going to be looking at today is actually viable for either one of those positions. Now, most all historical investigations involve what is known as abductive reasoning. Abductive reasoning, you review the evidence at hand, And then you either propose or review theories which best explain the data. And the hypothesis which does the best job of fitting the data is considered to be the most likely and rational explanation. Again, almost all historical investigations rely upon abductive reasoning. When they decided that it was a meteor that hit the earth and killed off the dinosaurs, they used abductive reasoning to reach that conclusion. Every criminal investigation appeals to abductive reasoning in order to get a guilty or innocent verdict. So what I would like to do is, as we're considering the evidence, we want to consider the evidence in the light of two different hypotheses, okay? So the first hypothesis is the biblical position that this is true history, the vast majority of which was recorded by Moses, who lived in Egypt, some of it from previous materials handed down both orally and in written form, and some of it was his own eyewitness testimony. Conversely, we have the minimalist position, which asserts that these stories have been invented, that they have no basis in history whatsoever, and that they were woven into an epic myth over 1,000 years after the time of the events that they supposedly describe. So as we move forward, we want to ask ourselves, which of these hypotheses best fits the data at hand? Now, it would be a bifurcation to say that those are the only two theories. Actually, those two theories are at the extremes, and there are a lot of hypotheses that are in between. But at the end of the day, one side tends to believe that there are sources that date closer to the period of time of the events that are being described, and that they are describing real people and events. At the other side, they try to say that the sources date much, much later than those events, and for the most part, they have been fabricated. So very clearly, the historical writers of this narrative are conveying it as if they believe that it's true history. That's obvious in the writing. Furthermore, the nation of Israel itself has embraced this narrative as being factual from its very earliest writings. And so the secular scholars Nahum Sarna and Herschel Shanks note, no nation would likely invent for itself and faithfully transmit century after century and millennium after millennium such an inglorious and inconvenient tradition unless it had an authentic historical core. We are simply at a loss to explain the need to fabricate such an uncomfortable account of Israel's disreputable national origins. Nor can we explain how such a falsity could so pervade the national psyche as to eliminate all other traditions and historical memories. The historical core of an exodus of some sort seems highly likely. Scholars like to point out that this epic of the Israelites being in Egypt and the Exodus makes up about 1/7 of the entire material from Genesis to Kings. That's 12 of the books in the Old Testament. It also pervades the books of all of the prophets and the Psalms. It is a thread that appears to be woven through the entire Old Testament. It seems unlikely that a nation would trace its history and ancestral homeland to its traditional enemies, being Egypt, Syria, and Mesopotamia, unless it were true. It seems unthinkable that Israel could have existed as a nation with no core historical tradition before these biblical writers supposedly invented one after the Babylonian exile of the 500s BC. Now, the Bible notes in numerous places that the Israelites settled in Goshen, which is located in the Nile Delta. Okay? There, it was a very fertile region, as you can tell from the slide, and their annual floods continually soak the region with fertilizing nitrates. Now, what's great for farming is horrible for document preservation. So the Egyptologist James Hoffmeyer notes, in the moist environment of the delta, surviving papyri are rare. At the excavation at Tel Adaba, which is ancient Avaris, the Hyksos capital, directed by Manfred Bitak, no papyrus has survived. Indeed, after more than 35 years, Bitak's team has not discovered any papyri. At the nearby sister site of Cantir, after nearly 25 years of work, Edgar Push and his colleagues have likewise not discovered any papyri. In short, the Nile Delta, where the Bible says the ancient Israelites lived, has produced no historical or administrative documents that might shed light on any period. This quote is from Biblical Archaeology Review, which is a secular magazine. I'm going to have several quotes from Biblical Archaeology Review Just want you to know it's not a religious publication. It is a secular publication. They publish articles from scholars and archaeologists from all persuasions. So the Egyptologist Kenneth Kitchen elaborates on that, noting, those who squawk intermittently, quote, no trace of the Hebrews has ever been found, so of course no Exodus, are wasting their breath. Practically no written records of any extent have been retrieved in the Delta sites. A tiny fraction of reports from the East Delta occur in papyri recovered from the desert near Memphis. 99% of New Kingdom papyri are irrevocably lost, administrative or otherwise. Now, we know from such stone inscriptions that there were voluminous papyrus archives, of which no minutest scrap now survives. In the sopping wet mud of the Delta, no papyrus ever survives, whether it mentions fleeing Hebrews or not. In other words, as the official 13th century archives from the East Delta centers are 100% lost, we cannot expect to find mentions in them of Hebrews or anybody else. So if no papyrus has survived, then we're limited to what we find on stone inscriptions. And we tend to find stone inscriptions on monuments and palaces and temple walls. But the problem with that is that the inscriptions you find on monuments and palaces and temple walls, they tend to memorialize great accomplishments, deeds of valor, great victories. They never monumentalize or memorialize humiliations and defeats. So here again, the Egyptologist James Hoffmeyer confirms the types of royal inscriptions found on stela in temples never include any negative reports about Pharaoh and his armies. Rather, they speak of his triumphs and deeds of valor. Consequently, no one will ever find a stela commemorating the humiliation of Pharaoh as a result of the plagues or the defeat of the Egyptian forces dispatched to bring the fleeing Hebrews back to Egypt. It can't be a source of criticism that there are no inscriptions referring to the Hebrews or Israelites when in fact there have been no papyri discovered in the Nile Delta period that describes any period of that history, and we wouldn't expect such details to be found on stone inscriptions we'd find on monuments and palaces and temple walls. However, in fact, we have found a substantial number of both textual and stone inscriptions that do detail Semites immigrating into Egypt and settling in the Nile Delta, just as the Bible tells us that Jacob, Joseph, and their families did. The ancient epigrapher Orly Goldwasser confirms, to the Asiatics, as they were called. Remember that term, Asiatics. We're going to come back to this in a moment, but at this point forward, make a note of each time someone uses that term, Asiatic. To the Asiatics, as they were called, the lush Nile Delta was a veritable Garden of Eden. From earliest of times, Canaanites and other Asiatics would come and settle here. Indeed, this is the background of the biblical story of the famine in Canaan that led to Joseph's descent into Egypt. By the beginning of the Egyptian Middle Kingdom, a few years after 2000 BC, the pressure of immigrants on the eastern delta was so strong that the Egyptian authorities built a series of forts at strategic points to, quote, repel the Asiatics, as the story of Senhu tells us. In the tomb of Numhotep is a mural that portrays Semites immigrating into Egypt. We know that these are Semites or Canaanites because of their hairstyle and because of their wardrobe. Canaanites and Semites are consistently portrayed this way in mural throughout Egypt. Scholars Shanks and Nahum also note in a text known as the Instruction from Merikawe, an Egyptian ruler speaks to his son, quote, the East, referring to the Nile Delta, abounds with foreigners. Now, speaking about these foreigners, as for miserable Asiatic, wretched is the place where he is. Food causes his feet to roam about. Here, according to an Egyptian record, Asiatics have roamed into the eastern delta to find food, just as the Israelites are said to have done. And just like today, some things never change, right? You have a local complaining about the immigrants that are coming in and how they're coming across the border, right? So some things just never change. So the Egyptologist Manfred Betak's excavations in the Nile Delta at Tel Adaba, at Avaris, as we noted previously, has confirmed that the religious architecture, the burial traditions, the ceramics, and bronzes all show a strong connection with Semites from Canaan. Therefore, it is widely recognized that a large contingent lived there. In my previous presentation titled The Invention of the Alphabet and the Roots of the Bible, we talked about how Semites who were working at the turquoise mines of Serebet el-Qadim appeared to have invented the alphabet. And once we were able to decipher that alphabet, it became clear that the language was Canaanite. And so scholars universally agree that it appears that Semites working in Egypt invented the alphabet. And this discovery is approximately the time period of Joseph. Not that Joseph had anything to do with the invention of the alphabet, but it again confirms that there are Semites living in Egypt at that particular time. Now, earlier I mentioned that there are practically no papyri that have been discovered in the Nile Delta. However, there have been an abundance of papyri that have been discovered throughout the more arid and desert regions of Egypt. One of those is called the Brooklyn Papyrus. This picture is just a portion of the Brooklyn Papyrus. It's actually about 7 feet long. The archaeologist Dr. Titus Kennedy notes, a section of the papyrus contains a list of 95 servants, many of whom are specified as Asiatic or coming from Western Asia, meaning primarily Canaan. Approximately 30 of the servants have names identified as Semitic. 9 of these servants appear to have specifically Hebrew names. The Hebrew names found on the list include Menahemah, a feminine form of Menahem, Asherah, a feminine form of Asher, the name of one of the sons of Jacob, also the name of one of the tribes of Israelite, Shiphrah, the name of one of the Hebrew midwives prior to the Exodus. This list is clear attestation of Hebrews living in Egypt prior to the Exodus. So at this point, 2 points really should be emphasized. First one is, recall how William Dever noted that there were no inscriptions that specifically refer to Hebrews or Israelites. Okay? However, we do have an abundance of inscriptions that refer to Asiatics. Biblical Archaeology Review notes that the term Asiatic was applied to all foreigners in Egypt, most of whom were Semites from Canaan and other lands northeast of Egypt. And so the Egyptologist Kenneth Kitchen elaborates, noting, minimalists complain that no Israelites are mentioned in Egypt on tomb or temple walls or papyri. Well, of course not. Levantines, meaning Canaanites, in Egypt were universally described simply as Asiatics, not by specific affiliations. So it doesn't appear that the Egyptians would have used the term Hebrew or Israelite. Instead, they would have used the term Asiatic, which is the same term that they used to refer to other Semites and Canaanites and Phoenicians and Akkadians who were in Egypt in similar circumstances. The second point is that prior to the Mosaic Law, which was handed down to the Israelites after they departed Egypt, and was partially intended to help separate them as God's chosen people, separate them from the other Semites and Canaanites living in Canaan, how would archaeologists be able to distinguish between those early Israelites and other Semites and Canaanites living in similar circumstances? Again, the Egyptologist James Hoffmeyer elaborates, noting, archaeology's ability to determine the ethnicity of a people in the archaeological record, especially the Israelites at such an early period, is quite limited. What kind of pottery would they have used? What house plans would they have lived in? What sort of burial traditions did they practice? And would archaeologists be able to identify the burial of these early Israelites who ended up being slaves anyway? And how are all these things different from those Canaanites and other Semitic-speaking peoples in Egypt at the time? Although the evidence doesn't specifically say Joseph or Moses or Hebrews or Israelites, there is an abundance of evidence that does correspond very closely with the biblical narrative. And that's what we want to focus on. We want to focus on the data, the Egyptian data, that does correspond with the biblical data. So let's take a look at some of that. So in Genesis, we're told that Joseph's brothers were getting ready to kill him. And then they looked up and they saw a caravan of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead. Their camels were loaded with spices, balm, and myrrh, and they were on their way to take them down to Egypt. Now, at some point in the past, National Geographic noted, Genesis claims that the Ishmaelite caravan rode camels, But that is probably the imagination of the scribes who compiled the final version of the Torah in the 6th or 5th century BCE. Archaeological evidence has shown that camels were not domesticated in the Near East until around 1200 BCE and became the standard mode of long-distance transport only well after the 10th century. So the author is suggesting that this reference in Genesis, as a matter of fact, all of the references in Genesis to camels is an anachronism. An anachronism is a chronological error. And so if you have a writer writing in a later time period trying to describe an earlier event, and he makes a mistake by describing something that didn't fit that earlier time period, then that's considered to be an anachronism, a chronological error. Biblical naysayers love to point to camels in Genesis as an example that this really is just a made-up fictional narrative. The problem with that is that it has to ignore a lot of the evidence to the contrary. So as but a sample, a plaque from Yushnuna in modern Iraq dating to the 3rd millennium, my slide says 3000s BC, the 3rd millennium would be 2000s BC, shows a camel being ridden by a human. An 18th century BC text, quoting from an earlier 2000s BC text from Nippur in modern Iraq, refers to the milk of the camel as sweet. Many scholars believe that that is referring to a domesticated camel. A tablet from Ugarit, dated to about 1900 BC, includes a camel on its list of domesticated animals. A cylinder seal dating to 1800 to 1650 BC depicts a camel riding on 2 humps of a Bactrian camel. And in Egypt, petroglyphs from the Old Kingdom and the Middle Kingdom depict camels being used as pack animals. So Professor Mark Chavalas notes, a close inspection of Genesis leads to the conclusion that Abraham was not from Israel, but Mesopotamia, meaning modern Iraq and inland Syria. Scholars studying this area know of textual, artistic, and archaeological evidence for camels long before the supposed time of Abraham and his family. Moreover, the sporadic accounts in Genesis concerning camels usually occur outside Israel in northern Mesopotamia, and occasionally when they travel to Egypt, precisely where much of our external evidence comes from. I think this evidence is more than enough to discount the idea that the Genesis source superimposed camels in the patriarchal narratives. Another thing that often helps to date writings or date events are the prices of things at that particular time. My earliest memory of gas prices is in the 1970s when we were in Odessa, and I remember gas was 35 cents a gallon. Some of you who are older than me, you may remember prices lower than that. You don't have to admit that, but you very well may, okay? So a lot of times when I watch old movies or old television shows and I watch the car pull into the fill-in station, right, or the gas station, and you'll see what the price of gas was, it is always a reminder to me of the time period that that is being filmed, or the time period that that is. We also see this in the Genesis narrative. In Genesis 37, we're told that his brothers pulled Joseph up out of the cistern and sold him for 20 shekels of silver to the Ishmaelites, who took him to Egypt. So likewise, the price of a slave offers a chronological marker. Professor Mark Rooker notes, 20 shekels was the same price of a slave in the first quarter of the 2nd millennium in the laws of Hammurabi and in the Mari texts. By the 14th and 13th centuries BC, as represented at Nuzi and Ugarit, the price of a slave had crept up to 30 shekels, consistent with the cost of a slave at the time of Moses, as is detailed in Exodus 21. Later, in the Assyrian period, near the beginning of the 1st millennium BC, the price of a slave had gone up to 50 to 60 shekels, which I don't have the biblical reference here, but that is also in Kings. They note the price of a slave at that time was at that price. And then later, in the Persian period, which is the time period when minimalists believed that this story was invented, the cost of slaves jumped to between 90 and 120 shekels. The inflationary change of the cost of a slave precisely pinpoints the time of the patriarchs to the first quarter of the 2nd millennium BC. Genesis 39, we're also told that Potiphar made Joseph overseer of his house, and all that he owned he put in his charge. It came about that from the time that Potiphar made Joseph overseer in his house, and over all that he owned, the Lord blessed the Egyptian's house on account of Joseph. So the Egyptologist James Hoffmeyer notes, Papyrus Brooklyn 35 lists the Semitic names of dozens of male and female servants attached to a particular estate. Interestingly, a number of these servants are identified as, quote, he who is over the house. Now that the Hebrew, he's talking about the Hebrew in the Genesis narrative, is a translation of the Egyptian expression is likely, and it's supported by the semantic correspondence between the two expressions. His point being the fact that in the Genesis narrative that the Hebrew title appears to be borrowed from the Egyptian use of that title appears to give us good evidence that in fact that is the genuine title. Not only is it authentically Egyptian, but it also dates to the correct chronological time period of the events. Another thing that can be used as a chronological marker is the names of people. So my grandparents on my mother's side are called Grover and Agnes. You may have parents or grandparents who are called Clarence or Theodore or Elmer or perhaps Mildred or Myrtle or Ethel, okay? Those are common names at a specific time and in a specific place. Similarly, there are names in Genesis that are specific to that period of time. So Professor Mark Rooker notes, the personal names that occur in the Mari text provide one of the most potent arguments for the second millennium BC, dating of the patriarchs, for it is in these texts that we come across names that are relationally similar to the patriarchs in various lists. The form of the patriarchal names of Isaac, Jacob, Israel, Joseph, and Ishmael begin with the IY prefix, which are common in the Mari archives of the early second millennium BC. So in the Mari archives, we've been able to accumulate a list of over 6,000 West Semitic names. And his point is that these names in the Genesis narrative fit the chronology of the Mari text. Now, some of these names do occur later in the second millennium, but their use is unparalleled in the first half of the millennium, and you don't find these names hardly at all in the first millennium, which is when minimalists believed that these texts were invented. In Genesis 41, we're told that Pharaoh named Joseph Zaphenath-Paneah and gave him Asenath, the daughter of Potiphar, the priest of On, as his wife. The Egyptologist James Hoffmeyer notes, the names in the Joseph narrative are Potiphar, who is Joseph's master, Asenath, Joseph's wife, Potiphar, Joseph's father-in-law, and Zaphenath-Paneah, Joseph's Egyptian name conferred upon him by Pharaoh. All agree that they are undeniably Egyptian. Changing Joseph's name from his Semitic name to his Egyptian name is also noteworthy. The Egyptologist Kenneth Kitchen notes, Joseph's full name in Egypt would have been Joseph, who is called Dietnaf Ipianka. The Ipianka names are very common in the Middle Kingdom, but not later. So we have good phonetics, attested forms, and an early date. We also have the same usage for foreigners in the Middle Kingdom. The Papyrus Brooklyn has 48 Asiatics in its list of 77 household names, and 28 of these show precisely the construction proposed here, the Semitic name who is called by his Egyptian name. One could hardly ask for a better pedigree than this. And then in the narrative, we also have the detail about Joseph being promoted to vizier, which is considered to be the second in command of all of Israel. Genesis 41 notes, so Pharaoh said to Joseph, you shall be over my house, and according to your command, all my people shall do homage. Only in the throne I will be greater than you. Then Pharaoh took off his signet ring from his hand, and he put it on Joseph's hand, and clothed him in garments of fine linen, and he put the gold necklace around his neck. He had him ride in his second chariot, and they proclaimed before him, bow the knee. And he set him over all the land of Egypt. The Genesis narrative tells a story, an unlikely story, about how Joseph rose from being a slave and then a prisoner, and through a series of events was promoted to vizier, the second in command of all of Egypt. A lot of people have found this to be hard to truly swallow. They think it's pretty fanciful, and they think it's, again, another example of the made-up fairy tale nature of the Genesis narrative. However, we do have numerous examples in Egypt of Semites who have been promoted to various levels of power in Egypt. And as but one example, in the late 1980s, a tomb was discovered in Saqqara belonging to a man named Aparel. Aparel was a Canaanite who apparently rose to vizier, again, second in command of all of Egypt. Egyptologist James Hoffmeyer elaborates, "It is safe to say that in Aparel, who is a vizier and Semite, we have a striking parallel to Joseph in Genesis, and some provisional comments can be made. First, this discovery is the first time this high-ranking official's name appeared on a monument after over a century of exploration at Saqqara. If such a high-ranking official as Vizier Aparel was completely unknown to modern scholarship until the late 1980s, despite the fact that he lived in one of the better documented periods of Egyptian history, it is wrong to demand, as some have, that direct archaeological evidence for Joseph should be available if he were in fact a historical figure. This point is especially true for Joseph, since his provenance in Genesis is the very poorly documented Delta. Second, Aparel is a Semitic name, as those of his wife and son are, which strongly suggests that he was a Semite. The Aparel family not only bore Semitic names, but they also followed the late Bronze Age Canaanite tradition of family burials while adopting many Egyptian funerary practices. Genesis 50 reports that Jacob was mummified according to Egyptian prescriptions, and Joseph himself was placed in a coffin. Neither mummification nor the use of coffins was known in Canaan during the Bronze Age. These clearly are Egyptian practices used by the Hebrew patriarchs Jacob and Joseph, precisely like those employed for Aparel in his family. The Egyptologist Kenneth Kitchen further elaborates, Joseph's appointment by Pharaoh was accompanied by his being robed in fine linen, given a gold collar, and entrusted with a state seal, plus the use of the second chariot after the king. All this fits both the Middle and the New Kingdoms. These procedures are authentically Egyptian. And the final data is Joseph's age given to us at death. So Genesis 50 states that Joseph stayed in Egypt along with all of his father's family, and he lived to 110 years. Once again, we have a detail in the narrative that appears to be somewhat fanciful. What are the chances that Joseph could have lived to be 110 years in that day and age? And so a lot of people, again, a lot of skeptics point to this as, again, an example of the made-up fairy tale nature of the narrative. However, Egyptologists will also note that it finds itself very much at home in an Egyptian culture and setting. This 110-year mark actually represents the ideal life in Egyptian aspirations. We have numerous inscriptions of prayers where people are praying to their God and they're asking that they be given the life of 110 years. We have many wishes where they are wishing to confer upon someone else, a family member, perhaps a son or someone, please let my son live to 110 years. In Egypt, to say that a person lived to 110 years is to say that that person lived a long, a robust, a well life. The Egyptologist Kenneth Kitchen confirms, when Joseph died, he's reputed to have attained 110 years. Now, in an Egyptian setting, it cannot really be coincidence that this same figure happens to be the ideal lifespan in Egyptian aspirations. In Egypt, the 110-year tradition ran from the Old Kingdom down to the Hellenistic period, but the attested mentions clusters in the Ramesside period, which is the approximate time frame that most conservative Bible scholars believe a lot of this material was recorded. Thus, as others have noted, this feature is specifically Egyptian. Now, as noted previously, during the Middle Kingdom, which was about 2100 BC to roughly 1780 BC, we have numerous inscriptions and murals and stone inscriptions that confirm that Semites were immigrating into Egypt. They were settling in Egypt, including the Nile Delta, and they were moving about in Egypt. Okay? However, over time, as the leadership of the Egyptian pharaohs weakened during the 13th dynasty, it appears that some of these Asiatics were able to wrestle power away from the Egyptians and they took control of Egypt in an era known as the period of the Hyksos. Now, documentation of the Hyksos rule is negligible, as we'll further note, so historians are struggling to piece together a narrative that best fits the data. We don't know precisely how they took control. We don't know whether it was some sort of a military campaign where they came in and took over, or whether it was some sort of rise to power from within. The Hyksos rule would consist of the 14th, 15th, and 16th Egyptian dynasties. They would rule for approximately 100 years from 1650 to 1550 BC, and they appeared to have about 6 kings during that 100-year reign. Now, most scholars currently identify them as Canaanites. The few preserved names are Semitic. One of the 3 names for the kings for which we have a name was Jacob-Hur, an obvious resemblance to the name Jacob from the Bible. Not that it was Jacob, but it's, again, evidence of a Semite being in Egypt. The pottery, the burial customs, and architectural style at Avaris, the Hyksos capital in the Nile Delta, all suggest that the Hyksos were Canaanite in origin. Egyptian Pharaoh Ahmose I is traditionally credited for rising to power in the southern kingdom of Thebes, defeating the Hyksos and chasing them back to Canaan, and then defeating other Canaanite city-states while he was there. Most of the records from the Hyksos period were destroyed during Ahmose's vengeful destruction of their capital city at Avaris. The Egyptians made a concerted effort to purge their rule from Egyptian history and landscape. The Egyptians destroyed the records of this period so thoroughly that there is uncertainty over the names and even the number of kings during the period of the Hyksos. We don't even know what they called themselves. The 3rd century Egyptian historian Manetho refers to them as the Hyksos, which is Hyksos in Greek. That's where they get their name. That is sometimes loosely translated as desert princes, or sometimes you'll see foreign rulers. The last monuments of their capital in Avaris were left to crumble until the Nile tributary silted up. And by 1525 BC, the northern and southern Egypt were united again, and the foreign rulers were gone. Vowing never, ever again to allow foreign rulers to take over and control Egypt, the next series of pharaohs were all military kings. They built up extensive military forts around Egypt to prevent people from coming. They also led numerous military campaigns into Canaan in order to subdue them and subject them so that they couldn't get strong enough to come and take over again. So Genesis ends with the death of Joseph. And then we have about a 200-year period before the Hyksos rise and take over Egypt. The Hyksos rule for 100 years, and then Ahmose I dispatches them from Egypt, and you have this series of military kings that follow after that. And this is where Exodus begins. Exodus chapter 1 states, "Then a new king, who did not know about Joseph, came to power in Egypt. Look," he said to his people, "the Israelites have become much too numerous for us. Come, we must deal shrewdly with them, or they'll become even more numerous, and if war breaks out, they will join our enemies, fight against us, and leave the country." So they put slave masters over them to oppress them with forced labor. So again, the Egyptologist James Hoffmeyer notes, the Hebrews would have found themselves in the unenviable position of being too closely associated with Semitic rulers to be ignored. The new kings from distant Thebes would not have been aware of Joseph and his contributions to the northern court in the preceding era. Moreover, an association of the Hebrews with their fellow Semites who had ruled Lower Egypt might explain the hostile treatment and the paranoid Pharaoh's statement, quote, "If war befalls us, they will join our enemies," referring to the recently departed Hyksos, "and fight against us." National Geographic also confirms, according to the Bible, the king observed the Israelite tribes and marveled at their sheer numbers. The king decided to set taskmasters over them to oppress them with forced labor. Quite apart from their prospective association with the despised Hyksos period, almost every pharaoh since Ahmose I had found himself fighting one Asiatic incursion after another. If indeed Egypt's king still considered the Canaanite settlements in Goshen as foreign colonies, close in language and customs to the tribes that they routinely battled in the east, then the animosity towards the Hebrews certainly seems quite plausible. The historical setting of both the Genesis and the Exodus narratives closely mirrors and corresponds very well with the Egyptian history we know before and after the period of the Hyksos. Before the period of the Hyksos, we have evidence of Semites who are immigrating into Egypt. We have evidence that they're working there as servants, both in lower level and higher level positions of servanthood. We have evidence of them working at the turquoise mines. Some of these were slaves. The workers at the turquoise mines, they believe, were not slaves. They believed that those were just workers who chose to work there. Some of the servants were slaves. Many of the servants were not slaves. They believed that some of those servants were just descendants of other Semites who had been living there in Egypt for some time. You didn't see that state-sponsored oppression that you do in a later period. It's after the period of the Hyksos, after Amhos I dispatches the Hyksos, that we see that true state-sponsored slavery that is described in detail in the book of Exodus. Now, earlier I encouraged you to consider two hypotheses as we reviewed the data. So the first hypothesis was the biblical position that this is true history, the vast majority of which was recorded by Moses, who lived in Egypt. Some of it from previous materials handed down both orally and in written form, and some of it was his own eyewitness testimony. Conversely, we had the minimalist position, which asserts that these stories have been invented, that they have no basis in history whatsoever, and were woven into an epic myth over 1,000 years after the time of the events that they supposedly describe. So again, consider the points just reviewed. There are no administrative references to Israelites in Egypt because no papyri have survived in the Nile Delta. There are no monumental inscriptions because Egyptian humiliations would have never been memorialized. However, there is an abundance of textual reference to Asiatics, as the Egyptians would have called the Israelites settling and existing in the Nile Delta. Israelites have recognized their history in Egypt from their very earliest writings. There is an abundance of evidence of Semites entering Egypt in the exact manner as described in Genesis. There is textual and archaeological evidence for Semites settling in biblical Goshen, the Nile Delta, as described in Genesis. An Egyptian papyrus confirms the existence of Semitic servants, some with distinctly Hebrew names, and some serving in the same capacity with the same title of Joseph, as described in Genesis. The reference to camels described in Genesis, once thought to be an anachronistic error, now has textual, artistic, and archaeological support. The slave price and the names of the patriots fit the chronological time period of the events. The names of Joseph's master and relatives, the tradition of changing a servant's name from Semitic to Egyptian, the description of the rewards given to someone promoted to the office of vizier, and Joseph's age at death are all authentically Egyptian. Now, considering this data, the following are just a couple of quotes from some secular scholars. The first one is going to be from the Egyptologists Leonard and Barbara Lesko. They note, whatever doubts scholars may entertain about the historicity of the Exodus narratives, memories of an Israelite sojourn in Egypt seem too sharply etched to dismiss out of hand. The biblical account simply contains too many accurate details and bears too many correspondences with Egyptian records to ignore. Professor Mark Rooker notes, the events described in the Pentateuchal narratives are plausible because they are in harmony with all that is known about the culture of the first half of the second millennium. And then the Egyptologist James Hoffmeyer summarizes, the evidence is overwhelming for Egypt's influence on the Hebrews because of their lengthy sojourn in the Nile Valley. There are genuine Egyptian features present in the Genesis narratives, including terms, toponyms, and personal names. The Egyptologist Alan Schulman claims that the writer of the Hebrew narrative, quote, had an exceedingly intimate knowledge of Egyptian life, literature, and culture, particularly in respect to the Egyptian court, and in fact, may have lived in Egypt for a time. The major question was, is the picture portrayed in Genesis compatible with what is known from Egyptian history? I think we've answered that in the affirmative. How should the Genesis and Exodus narratives be treated once the supporting evidence presented is taken into account? Would a rejected out of hand would be pure obscurantism? It is inconceivable that early Israelites were incapable of preserving their early history either in oral or written form from the second half of the millennium onward. Only by special pleading can the minimalists argue that during the late Bronze Age that the Israelites were the only nation who could not record historical events. The body of evidence provides indirect evidence which shows that the main points of Israel and Egypt are indeed plausible. My wife's favorite book series is from a genre known as historical fiction. And so in historical fiction, the author will thoroughly research this previous period of time and then will do their best to accurately represent the culture, the historical setting, the political environment, some of the events that happened in that particular period of time, as well as some of the historical figures from that period of time. And then that author will sort of weave in this fictional narrative with fictional characters and events that happen in that true and accurate historical period. Now, historical fiction is a modern genre. We have no example of an ancient writer thoroughly researching a previous period of history and then inventing a fictional narrative in an attempt to insert it back into that true and accurate time period. Given that the details of Genesis and Exodus so closely parallels what we know from Egyptian history, it really seems hard to fathom that an ancient writer writing in about 5 to 300 BC, a good 1,000 to 1,500 years after the events that they're attempting to describe, could so accurately describe that previous period of history and correspond so well with it, especially given the fact that it is occurring in a foreign country that has completely different cultural and social structures and conventions from where that author lives. Now, it seems much more logical, rational, that the writer of Genesis or the editors of Genesis had access to sources that were written much closer to the time period of events that were being described. It gives us every reason to believe that they were, in fact, discussing and detailing real persons and events. So that is my presentation at this point. Yeah, well, obviously, discovering an inscription that refers to Joseph or Moses specifically would be very big. And so I don't know if you're aware of this, but skeptics had the same conclusion about King David up until about 1993. They thought that King David was imagined. They did not think that the Davidic Empire was as big and as glorious as the Bible said. And they didn't think that he existed. And they thought that if he did exist, then he might have been a tribal leader of some sort of tribe, and that legend just sort of grew. And then in 1993, we found our first archaeological evidence referring to the house of David, showing that not only did David exist, but it was the house of David, that he established this reign. And since then, there have been numerous discoveries that have fleshed that out even more. So in the future, I would say that would be very helpful. I will also say minimalists, it doesn't matter what we're going to find, minimalists are not going to accept it. Minimalists have not accepted that archaeological discovery. They've claimed that it was a plant. Okay? They have tried to minimalize it and say that no, that's not referring to that David. For instance, the Minerva stela is the very earliest non-biblical reference to the Israelites as a nation. It's on an Egyptian stela that dates to 1220 BC, and it's about a military campaign into Canaan where they encountered the Israelites. Minimalists do not accept that as referring to the nation of Israel. They think that's somebody else. So skeptics will always twist the data, okay? But for us, it would be very confirming. I will tell you one thing that I personally would like to see is one anachronism is the use of chariots in the Bible. So a lot of skeptics will point to the reference to Joseph being able to use a chariot, and there's a question as to when chariots arose in Egypt. They generally agree that the chariots arose during the period of the Hyksos. And so some of the scholars who believe that Joseph actually existed in the period of the Hyksos, that is confirmational. But if you're someone who believes the more straightforward reading of the biblical narrative, that he was about 150 to 200 years earlier than that, then it would be nice to find some sort of evidence that chariots did exist in some fashion. Now, the word that is used and translated into chariot may describe some sort of a vehicle that's not the kind of chariot that we think of. It may be some sort of precursor vehicle that evolved into the chariot that we all think about. So again, that's a future thing that I would be interested in seeing. Okay. Okay, right. Yes?
So you mentioned the historical fiction of the modern construct, which is an interesting take on it.
Yes.
If somebody, just spitting out the hypothetical, if somebody would actually try to have done that at the time that you mentioned, would they have had access to records in sufficient number to be able to do that?
Well, they certainly would have had access to records of some sort. So actually, a lot that we, and this is sort of interesting, a lot that we know about the Egyptian dynasties, we know from Manetho, who was a 3rd century Egyptian historian, meaning that he was in 200s BC. Okay? So the irony of that is that a lot of scholars accept his writings as detailing true history, but then they try and say, well, the Bible was written so long after the events, can't possibly be true, it was all made up, right? So Manetho certainly had some access to some records. We don't know what his sources were that he used. We also know that he got some of his details incorrect, because we've been able to discover sources that contradict that. So there would have been some sources, but there also would have been some things that, that they would not have had access to. So for example, my next presentation, which I don't know yet when that's going to be, in the next year or so, will focus on Moses and the Exodus. We know that Ramses, as a city, sort of disappeared off the face of the map from Egypt, and that people writing in the Persian and Hellenistic period, we're not sure that they would have even known about Ramses as a city. So some scholars point to the reference to Ramses in Genesis as confirmation that it was written much earlier than that time period, because the later people, they only knew about Avaris. Okay, they didn't know about Ramses. They knew about Luxor and Thebes, but Ramses literally disappeared off the mount until we found it and were able to re-excavate it. Yes?
I'm wondering if there are other civilizations that had a foundation story, a mytho-history perhaps, and how they have tried to embellish their greatness, maybe in China perhaps. One thought comes to mind, or the Mormons, talk about Book of Mormon, talking about people that came to the South America as Americans, whatever. But of course, they get tripped up by discoveries of fallacies in their narrative. But what about, say, the Chinese, other Mesopotamian people?
So I'm no authority whatsoever on the Chinese. I have some knowledge of the ancient Near East, much more limited knowledge versus the biblical history. Yes, I do believe that other cultures had a narrative, an origin, and I do believe that they embellished some of those, okay? I don't think there's any doubt that some of those were embellished. One of the points that's made in regard to the Israelite history is that it would be unique because of the very humbling and embarrassing nature of their origin. They're saying when you have other peoples that talk about their origin, they tend to be a little bit more glorious, if you will. Now, I don't know how accurate that critique is. That is one scholar who made that point. I've got a couple of Greek and Roman scholars here in the front row, and if you want to ask them, specifically Ashton, who studied that more in college and in high school, you can certainly ask them. But to answer your question is yes, other cultures do have origins, and we do know that a lot of those have been embellished.
Quick question. In modern Egypt, today's Egypt,
Yes.
do they accept the presence of the Hebrews in Egypt according to biblical archaeology?
Not to my knowledge. It was interesting. I don't know if y'all have ever seen the archaeological program on the Discovery Channel called Expedition Unknown with Josh Gates. Well, Thursday, he had a new episode on Moses and the Israelites in Egypt, and it was interesting watching that. It was funny because I was watching it, and Lacey came down and sat beside me, and she's like, I've heard of that. I know all of this stuff. And so, but it was also interesting how they interpreted it differently. For instance, They say there's no reference to Hebrews or Israelites, okay, but they don't admit that there's an abundance of references to Asiatics, which is what they would have been called. Another 2 points that are in my notes is, one is, we don't know exactly when those two terms came to be used. Hebrews, the term Hebrews, almost certainly arose after they left Egypt, okay? So it wouldn't be reasonable to expect the Egypts to call them Hebrews. That would be an anachronistic error if we found that, right? Israelites, probably a pretty decent chance that the descendants of Jacob, by the time of Moses, identified themselves as Israelites. We don't know that for certain, but there's a decent chance. So we could potentially find a reference to that, but again, the Egyptians used Asiatics, and so in that program, they didn't point that out. They said that there were no inscriptions or mentions of Israelites in Egypt at all. Well, again, they didn't note the Brooklyn Papyrus, which is very important, that has 9 Hebrew servants listed there. So there are evidences. Some are more compelling than others. But again, universally scholars like to talk about how there's no direct evidence. What they want is Moses mentioned. They want Israel mentioned on something.
The very back.
Yeah, in the very back first, Ed. Sorry, yes.
Yeah, I was just curious as to your views on who actually wrote the bulk of the Torah. You may have said something about that and I missed it, but I'm curious for you to elaborate on that a little bit.
Yeah, so I think the bulk of the narrative, the details, the persons and events, I believe were probably written by Moses. It makes a lot of sense from a lot of different angles, and we'll probably discuss that more in the next presentation. I do think that his writings were heavily edited by later editors, that they were redacted into the books that we have today. Now, that's what I personally tend to believe. There are scholars who believe that, again, we talked about the documentary hypothesis in my last presentation, and so there are scholars who believe that they were written from about the 9th century down to the 5th century, that there were 4 different sources and that those were combined into the Pentateuch later. I personally don't have a problem with that if they used previous sources. And that's what some people say. Some people say that they were making this up as they were going along. Some people say, no, they had to have used previous sources. For example, in my next presentation, there are some passages in Exodus that clearly were written in the 12th century BC. Those are datable from the text and the style of the writing. Now, was that a part of the original writing, or was that just something that was a poem that was inserted in later, and the rest of it doesn't date to that time period? So again, those are all questions that scholars continue to argue about. Okay. Ed, and then you next. Yes, Ed.
Yeah, I had a question, and it's probably part of the next presentation. On bookending this, after the wandering in the wilderness, and once they finally, the next generation, was able to go in and start conquest in Canaan, the things, archaeology there does support things like Jericho and the walls falling, and especially some of the more recent archaeology that has found evidence of the siege of Jericho, for instance. And there seems to be more archaeological evidence as they move into Canaan and start the conquest at that point. And then you start seeing permanent dwellings, permanent structures, cities being established. And of course, that's where a lot of archaeology is coming from now. But is being able to look in that, while it's not evidence of the exodus of the Egyptians, it does tell the later story of then them coming into Canaan and then the conquest of those cities and those types of capitals. I mean, what type, again, it's circumstantial, but does it fit the timeline and the narrative to be able to stitch that together?
Sorry, what was your question? Did you have?
Yeah, is that something that, and maybe in the next narrative, when you talk about the one,
Okay.
but is that something that you can kind of back into the narrative of saying, well, this fits the timeline?
Yes.
Backing into when the Exodus would occur?
So actually, my previous presentation, which was on the invention of the alphabet and the roots of the Bible, we did deal with the rise of Israel in Canaan. And we looked at the archaeological evidence for that, and we looked at the dating of that. And so scholars, again, the first mention is the Stela of Minerpta that dates to about 1220 to 1210 BC that refers to Israel. And in that stela, it specifically refers to them as a people. It's the only name on the stela that refers to a people and not a government or a city-state or a city, okay? And scholars generally believe that this was a people that was sort of dwelling pastorally in the land and not necessarily in cities, okay? Which fits the period of the Judges, okay? And then Joshua, we talked a little bit about Joshua. And so they pretty universally agree that there's archaeological evidence of Israel in about 1200 BC in Israel. And so that's one of the reasons why scholars and archaeologists believe that the previous dates of their entry and their exit from Exodus were probably about 150 to 200 years later, okay? The real question is, when they left Egypt, they were a wandering people. When they wandered in the wilderness for 40 years, they were a wandering people. They did not build towns or cities, they lived in tents. If you look at the book of Judges, the very first 6 chapters of Judges, anytime they mention a dwelling, it's a tent. It's not until the judge who starts with a G, Gideon. It's not until Gideon that we see them referring to houses in cities. And so we know that when they entered Israel that they were wandering around in tents. We know that there would have been a period of them wandering around in tents. So more conservative scholars see, well, the archaeological record is not going to pick up on that. They're not building houses of stone. They're wandering around. One of the finds that we talked about in that last presentation is that there's a site that they now think is the very earliest Israelite site that they've discovered yet that only had stone enclosures, pens for animals. They could find no human remains or artifacts whatsoever in and around these, and so they hypothesized that they probably lived in tents around and then used that as pens for their animals. And so that might have been the very earliest evidence that they were starting to at least erect some archaeologically recoverable remains, if you will. And then there's also the question of the terracing of the land. That's one of the things that the Israelites introduced into Canaan, is how they terraced the land for agriculture. One of the things that coincided that was transitioning from the Bronze Age to the Iron Age. And so they're saying that one of the things that might have developed then was that transition into tools that they could have used to terrace the land and do the things that they began to do. So if you're interested in reading about that further, again, that presentation is on a DVD along with my notes over there, The Invention of the Alphabet and the Roots of the Bible. So, yes, in the very back.
Yeah, so I really appreciated hearing what you said about the date of 950 BC for Solomon. Kind of a stake in the ground, we know, we can verify for one of the disciplines and all when that was. That was good, I really appreciate knowing that. And so from there, you dated back to 2 other dates from biblical references.
Correct.
And then you also had dates where you moved those forward, where some scholars think it happened later than what biblical references alone would suggest.
Right.
So I know that a lot of times dates are susceptible to copy errors and things like that. So can you talk at all about the text
Sure.
of those dates and how reliable those are?
Sure. Yeah. So a couple of points to make. We do know that we suspect that there are some copyist errors when it comes to some dates. I can't remember it off the top of my head right now, but in my research, there was one number that people are pretty convinced that was a copyist error, and it was a different number. I can't remember if that was a date or if that was a number of people in the army. So we do think that has happened. There's another problem with numbers in the Bible. Numbers can be very symbolic, and so a lot of times our modern thinking interferes with the way that ancient writer was using that number. And so we have to be humble when we're trying to read the narrative, that we do our best to try and take it at face value and think of what it says. And we use archaeology and what we've learned about ancient peoples to help inform us of the best way to think about that and interpret that. So the scholars and the archaeologists who believe that the Exodus was later, they look at that biblical passage that says it was 480 years, and they interpret that more symbolically. They think that that's not 480 years. They think it has to do with the number of generations that was between those two, and then they come up with a smaller number of years in order to make that fit, make it happen. It's another one of those series where it has its advocates and it also has its critics. The critics will point out, yeah, the problem with that is they didn't do that before. There's no example of them using it in that manner before. That's obviously an interpretation that's trying to fit that time period into what in how you interpret the archaeological data, as opposed to looking at other ways where they've done that before and saying maybe they're doing it here. So yes, that's a part of the scholarly debate in regard to those time periods. And for instance, the number Eleph, Hebrew Eleph, which means 1,000, that's been problematic for the story of the Exodus. The hundreds of thousands of Israelites exiting is really problematic from a numerical point of view, because it's unlikely that there are that many Israelites at that period of time. They have estimated that if you take all, I think it was like 580,000 fighting men. If there were 580,000 men, they say that there would have been at least 2 million Israelites if you include women and children. And at the time, there probably were only 3.5 million people in the whole empire of Egypt at that time. Well, scholars also recognize that that Hebrew Eleph is also translated as clan and unit. And so some scholars believe that it's not 580,000, it's 580 units. So the question is, how many people are in a unit? And that gets the numbers down to a much more palatable number. So once again, you have scholars that are doing their best to interpret it as accurately as possible.
I wanted to just interject before Amy asked a question. I had done the math, it was about 2 million people or whatever.
Yes.
You took I-35 northbound, you put 10 people abreast, and you gave 6 feet between all of them, it would stretch from there to like Waco.
Okay. Yeah. It is a lot of people. So yes, and so I'm sorry, where's... Yes.
Like, there's a range of people who said that believe nothing in the Bible and will never believe anything, to people that are accepting a lot. And I was looking, and it seems like in Expel, the movie that was about the persecution of people that even think there might be design in academia, there are people that just don't hold water, don't carry water for Christianity, but the evidence has moved them that way, and they have a testimony of that, and then they get kicked out of whatever position they're in for even accepting. So do you know of people who are, I know nothing about archaeology, but do you know people who have personally been moved by the evidence in the direction of God, or even talk about that?
Well, I know a lot of the archaeologists just through reading their books and reading their articles, so there's a lot of names that I would love. As a matter of fact, his name is escaping me right now. He found a Hebrew inscription that dates to about 1050 BC, and we were doing a college visit to the Honors College. This was back when Ashton was either junior or senior in high school. We did an honors visit to Baylor. And while we were there, there was this another man and his daughter were there. And we got to talking, and he mentioned he was an archaeologist from Pittsburgh. And I said, oh, really? You know, I love archaeology. I wanted to be an archaeologist. Until I found out what you guys made. And then I decided that wasn't for me. And so we got to talking and started talking about this find and that find, and just we're talking back and forth, and he paid me the greatest compliment. We're talking about something, and then he stopped and he said, you know, you really know what you're talking about. And I was like, oh, that's so great. You know, he said that to me. Here's an archaeologist. And then literally Within 30 days, I'm on the treadmill watching a biblical archaeology television program, and then boom, there he is, and they're doing an interview talking about his find, and I felt like an idiot because here I'm walking around with him, and I'm supposed to know what I'm talking about in archaeology, and I didn't appreciate who it was I was walking around with. And I'm sorry, but I can't remember his name right now. But so I know that he was a Christian because his daughter was homeschooled, and I know that they were wanting to go to Baylor because it was Christian university. I do know I reached out to him last year, or maybe I think it was last year, to ask him if he would come down and speak, and I learned that he was retired, and so therefore he's not doing that anymore. But then I learned that his daughter went to either Cambridge or Oxford and was living in London. And again, I know his background and story, but a lot of these other archaeologists, I don't know their story, so I don't know if they've moved one way or the other. Deaver, he was a Christian at one point. He grew up in a Christian home. I think he was the son of a preacher, and then he moved to non-belief. Deaver's another one of those. I've read several of his books. I do think he's trying to be intellectually accurate. However, Deaver's one of those that will say that we really have to be humble about archaeological evidence because sometimes we make sweeping generalizations with not enough data, and then the next chapter he'll make this generalization and this generalization and this generalization as if it's fact. And so that seems to be counter to what he was initially saying. So I can't answer that question as well as I think you might have hoped. Do we have a question in the back?
I guess the minimalists don't believe that the Israelites were the chosen people. How do they explain Israel becoming the center of Western religion and not Sumerians or somebody else?
And I'm going to try and say this as respectfully as I can. A lot of minimalists they're really borderline anti-Semitic. They don't want the Israelites to have any sort of history. A lot of them, part of the problem with this whole subject is, one, it's political, two, it's religious. And when you have people in those two spectrums, they harden their points of view and they think what they're going to think, and they're not going to be open to anything to the contrary. So Israel existing in the land of Israel before the Babylonian exile is political because Israel claims that they have claims to that land, right? As opposed to, say, the Palestinians, who also think that they have a claim to that land. So a lot of the criticisms are specifically politically and religiously driven. And that's the problem with politics, is the truth doesn't matter. It's what I want you to think. Anybody else? Thank y'all so much. I appreciate the questions. Appreciate you coming.